You begin to feel it first as a bodily hesitation, not a thought, a small delay between what happens around you and what you feel obliged to carry. Someone in your family sighs heavily or speaks with that familiar wounded edge, and your nervous system does something new. It does not rush forward. It does not immediately translate their tension into your responsibility. There is a brief stillness, a gap. In the past, that gap would have frightened you. It would have felt like danger, like abandonment, like cruelty, but now the gap arrives quietly, almost like the psyche taking a breath you did not know it had been holding for decades. This is what the shame of being too much has been trying to prevent, not your loudness, not your emotion, not your sensitivity. What it has been trying to prevent is your separation, your psychological independence, because for a long time, separation did not mean freedom to you. It meant punishment. It meant loss of love. It meant being made into the problem. So your nervous system learned something very early. If you want to remain safe, you must reduce yourself. You must become lighter, less demanding, less present, less real. You must become useful. You must become agreeable. And more than that, you must become absorbent. You must take in what cannot be held by the people around you. Tension, anger, disappointment, anxiety, emptiness, and process it inside yourself as though it belonged to you. This is not generosity. This is conditioning. Shame is not merely an emotion. It is an organizing principle. It tells the psyche what is permitted to exist. It trains you to interpret your vitality as threat, and when vitality is interpreted as threat, the body moves toward collapse. It moves toward numbness, toward shutdown, toward a chronic internal silencing that looks like politeness from the outside. You have likely called it many things: being mature, being understanding, being the stable one, being the peacemaker, but internally it was never peace. It was surveillance. It was a constant scanning of the emotional climate, a compulsive monitoring of micro changes in tone, posture, facial expression, silence, not because you were curious, but because you were trained to equate safety with prediction. If you can predict their mood, you can adjust yourself. If you can adjust yourself, you can prevent rupture. If you can prevent rupture, you can remain loved. This is the unconscious bargain. The bargain does not sound like a bargain when you are a child. It feels like reality. It becomes your definition of love. Love becomes the act of managing someone else's inner world. Love becomes the act of not costing anyone anything. Love becomes the skill of disappearing without leaving the room. And later, as an adult, when someone tells you you are too sensitive, too intense, too emotional, too needy, something inside you collapses instantly. That collapse is not proportional to the moment. It is disproportionate because the nervous system is not reacting to a comment. It is reacting to the old threat. If you are too much, you will lose connection. If you are too much, you will be rejected. If you are too much, you will become unbearable, and being unbearable to the early psyche means being unprotected. So you shut down, your face becomes neutral, your voice becomes softer, you apologize even when you have done nothing, or you over-explain, hoping clarity will earn you permission to exist. And if the other person stays cold, If they look unimpressed by your sincerity, your nervous system goes even deeper. It begins to dissociate from your own needs. You become strangely calm, while internally you are leaving yourself. You become competent while you are abandoning your inner life. This is not strength. This is a survival intelligence that became a personality. It is important to see how early this pattern began, because it did not arise from weakness. It arose from a precise psychological adaptation. Many people imagine the empath as someone born kind, but what you call empathy is often the forced development of relational intelligence under emotional threat. When the family system is unstable, when one parent is fragile, volatile, absent, shaming, depressed, or demanding, the child's psyche must choose, remain authentic and risk losing attachment, or become relationally skilled and remain connected. The child chooses connection because the child must. The child cannot survive isolation. Therefore, the psyche constructs a self that can survive people. This is where the too much shame often originates, not from your essence, but from your impact on the system. You were not too much as a being. You were too much for their capacity. Your aliveness activated what they could not face within themselves. Your questions activated their inadequacy. Your feelings activated their unresolved grief. Your needs activated their shame. So, the system taught you, your intensity is dangerous, your expression is disruptive, your presence creates consequences, and you believed it. Because children always believe the emotional laws of their home, they do not call them laws, they call them love. There are micro scenes you can remember if you look honestly. You come home with a story, something that mattered to you, maybe a conflict at school, a dream you had, something you are proud of. You begin speaking, and you notice the parent's eyes drift. The body is there, but the attention is not, or you notice an irritation, a faint tightening of their face. You immediately shorten the story. You remove the emotion. You translate the experience into something digestible, and in doing this, without realizing it, you learn to edit your inner life in real time. You learn that the safest version of you is the smallest version. Or you sense that one of your parents is in a dark mood. The air in the room is heavy with something unspoken. You become quiet. You move carefully. You try to be helpful. You do not ask for anything. You feel guilty for existing, and the guilt has no logic, because you have done nothing wrong. But guilt is how the child's psyche makes sense of unpredictable tension. If it is my fault, then I can control it. If it is my fault, then I can fix it. This is the birth of people-pleasing, not kindness. Control through self-erasure, or you watch the adults arguing, and the argument is not about the surface topic. You can feel the deeper hunger underneath it, someone wanting to be seen, someone feeling powerless, someone trying to dominate, someone trying to escape. You pick up the invisible emotional weight in the room like a sponge. Later, you go to bed with an ache that does not belong to you, but you assume it does, because you have no boundary yet between your psyche and the psyche of the people you depend on. This is how the nervous system gets trained to shut down. It cannot sustain authentic expression when expression historically caused emotional consequences. Every time you expressed yourself and were met with irritation, withdrawal, mockery, or emotional coldness, The body learned to contract. The contraction becomes your default. And then, as an adult, you wonder why you cannot relax, why you feel chronically tense even when nothing is happening, why your stomach tightens when someone's tone shifts, why a delayed reply makes you spiral. You think you are fragile. You are not fragile. You are conditioned. The father complex and the mother complex grow from this soil, not as theory, but as lived architecture. You do not need to read it in books to understand it. If your mother was emotionally unpredictable, sometimes loving, sometimes shaming, sometimes needing you, your psyche learned that love is unstable. You learn to earn closeness by regulating her. You learn to sense her before sensing yourself. And later, you will feel irresistibly drawn to relationships where you must read the other person, where closeness must be earned through subtle labor. You call it chemistry. It is familiarity. It is the mother complex repeating itself as destiny. If your father was absent, critical, distant, or emotionally unreachable, your psyche learned that masculine energy is something you must chase, appease, impress, or decode. You learn to become excellent rather than genuine. You learn to be high functioning so you could feel worthy of being chosen. And later, you will be drawn to people who withhold affirmation, who do not fully meet you, who make you work for crumbs of recognition. You call it attraction. It is the father complex restaging the old wound. If I can finally be enough, I will finally be safe. And this is where narcissistic dynamics often attach themselves to you, not because you attract them mystically, but because the narcissistic person operates through projection and hunger. They unconsciously look for someone who will carry what they cannot feel. They cannot tolerate shame, dependency, vulnerability, inadequacy. So they locate a person with high relational intelligence, someone trained to manage emotions, and they attach. They feel relieved because you, without realizing it, begin doing what you did in childhood. You absorb their tension, translate their moods, take responsibility for the emotional field. You become the stabilizer. But what happens psychologically is more precise. The narcissistic personality often splits off their own shadow, everything they cannot tolerate about themselves, and places it outside. They must see it somewhere else. They must locate the burden in another person. You become the screen for their projection. You become the container for their disowned feelings. And because you are trained to carry what others cannot carry, you accept the role without noticing the trap. This is why, when you begin to withdraw emotionally now, they do not simply feel disappointed. They feel destabilized, because your withdrawal does not merely remove support, it removes the unconscious structure that allowed them to avoid themselves. When you stop carrying, they must feel. When you stop regulating, they must face their own dysregulation. When you stop explaining, they must confront the emptiness behind their control. And your family system reacts in a similar way. The system may not call it a system, but it is. Families have invisible roles. There is the scapegoat, the golden child, the lost one, the caretaker, the mediator. Your role, very likely, has been emotional containment. You are the one who makes things smooth, the one who understands everyone, the one who doesn't take things personally, the one who can handle it, the one who forgives quickly, the one who is spiritually mature, These are flattering labels, but often they are chains. Because when you stop performing that role, when you no longer absorb the tension after a passive-aggressive comment, when you no longer call to repair the silence, when you no longer apologize for someone else's mood, the system feels threatened, not because you did something wrong, but because you changed the equilibrium. Your nervous system is beginning to refuse the bargain, and the refusal creates shockwaves. You might notice it in small moments. A relative makes a sharp remark. In the past, your body would tighten and you would smile. Make a joke, soften it. Keep the peace. Now you simply look at them. You do not attack. You do not perform calmness. You simply do not move toward repair. And the room feels strange. There is an awkward silence. Someone clears their throat. Another person changes the subject quickly. You can feel them trying to restore the old pattern, where your nervous system returns to service, but you do not dramatically, not with a speech. You simply do not. This is the quiet power shift. It does not look like strength to the outside. It looks like distance. It looks like coldness. It looks like attitude. But inside it is something else. It is the psyche stepping out of a contract it never consciously signed. The shame of being too much is precisely what has kept you signed to it. Because if you believe your emotions are excessive, you will keep suppressing them. If you believe your needs are burdensome, you will keep minimizing them. If you believe your presence destabilizes others, you will keep managing their reactions. And managing their reactions will keep you in the role of emotional laborer, which will keep you in the position of pseudo-love. You will be valued for what you carry, not for what you are. The nervous system shuts down because it cannot hold this contradiction forever. You must reduce yourself to remain loved, yet your psyche demands to become whole. You cannot be whole while living as a function. You cannot individuate while remaining a role. At some point, the psyche begins to rebel, not with rage, but with exhaustion. It stops producing the energy required for self-erasure. This is what many people call depression, burnout, numbness, fatigue, loss of desire. But psychologically, it is often the psyche refusing to maintain the false arrangement. When the psyche withdraws energy from the adapted self, you feel emptiness, you feel flatness, you feel that your spark is gone. But often what is gone is not your essence. What is gone is the compensatory performance. The mask has become too expensive to wear, and this is the first stage, the quiet shutdown that precedes authority. Your nervous system, exhausted from decades of carrying, stops cooperating. It stops producing the immediate reflex of appeasement. It stops producing the fawn response automatically. You begin to pause, to hesitate, to feel a boundary forming where previously there was only absorption. This boundary feels unfamiliar. It can feel like guilt. You may suddenly feel selfish for not responding quickly, selfish for not explaining, selfish for not fixing the atmosphere. You may feel anxiety when you let someone be disappointed. That anxiety is the old training. The system taught you that other people's discomfort is dangerous, but the anxiety does not mean you are wrong. It means you are withdrawing from an addiction to relational responsibility. There is a particular moment that reveals the entire mechanism. Someone is upset. They are not clearly upset at you, but the mood enters the room like smoke. In the past, you would inhale it, you would make it yours, You would start thinking, what did I do? How can I fix it? What do they need? What should I say? Now, something inside you says, this does not belong to me. Not as an affirmation, not as a mantra, as a simple perception. And the moment you perceive that, the nervous system tries to do what it has always done, carry it, yet it cannot fully commit. It begins to hover. There is a tug of war inside, the old reflex versus the new truth. This internal tug is the essence of your transition, because you are not becoming a different person, you are simply becoming uncooperative with a certain kind of psychic theft. Projection must be understood here, because it explains why others respond intensely when you stop carrying. In projection, a person disowns an aspect of themselves and places it onto another. The more unconscious the person, the more they will insist that what they see in you is true. If they cannot tolerate their own neediness, they will accuse you of being needy. If they cannot tolerate their own anger, they will call you hostile. If they cannot tolerate their own shame, they will shame you. And because you are empathic, because you are relationally attuned, you will feel their accusation not only as words but as force. It hits your nervous system as threat. You reflexively try to neutralize it by explaining. You try to prove you are not what they projected. You try to rescue your identity. But what if you stop? This is where the power shift becomes structural. If you stop explaining, the projection has nowhere to land. If you stop absorbing, the emotional charge returns to its owner. And this is what destabilizes them. Not because you are punishing them, but because you are refusing to participate in the illusion that their inner world is your responsibility. Repetition, compulsion keeps you in these dynamics until the psyche learns the hidden reward. The reward is rarely obvious. You might think the reward is love, but often the reward is a kind of identity, the good one, the safe one, the needed one, the chosen one, the one who understands. You were rewarded for self-betrayal with belonging. You were rewarded for silence with approval. You were rewarded for emotional labor with temporary closeness. This is why you repeat it even when it hurts. Because the psyche is not seeking happiness, it is seeking familiarity. It is seeking the emotional shape of home. To stop repeating, you must first see the reward. You must see what part of you was still trying to earn something old. Perhaps you were still trying to earn a mother's softness that never came. Perhaps you were still trying to earn a father's recognition that always remained just out of reach. Perhaps you were still trying to prove that if you are good enough, gentle enough, wise enough, someone will finally stop making you feel like a problem. This is the tragic hope that keeps the empath bonded to painful dynamics. And shame is the rope used to drag you back. Shame tells you, if you withdraw, you are unloving. If you set a boundary, you are cruel. If you stop carrying, you are selfish. If you stop explaining, you are arrogant. Shame is not only an internal feeling, it is also a social weapon in many families. The moment you begin to individuate, someone will call you different. They will imply you have changed for the worse. They will speak nostalgically about the version of you that was easier to consume. And if your nervous system still believes that being too much leads to rejection, you will panic and return to the old role. So the psyche must do something radical, something quiet. It must begin to tolerate being misunderstood. You are entering that stage now. You may not announce it. You may not even admit it to yourself, but your body is doing it. You are tolerating the tension of not repairing. You are tolerating the discomfort of someone else's disappointment. You are tolerating the idea that your inner state is not a public resource. This does not feel triumphant. It often feels empty. Still, confusing. You might notice fewer messages, less invitation, less warmth from those who benefited from your emotional labor. This can feel like loss, but psychologically it is exposure. You are seeing which connections were built on you, carrying the relational weight. You are seeing what collapses when you stop over-functioning. And here, the nervous system may shut down again, not because you are regressing, but because the psyche is recalibrating. When you stop being needed, you must face a void. You must face the unfamiliar sensation of not being necessary to earn a place. This can feel like a kind of death. The adapted self begins to dissolve, and there is a period where you do not yet feel the solid presence of the integrated self. In that gap, you may feel numb, bored, unmotivated, unrecognizable to yourself. Do not interpret this as failure. The psyche often goes quiet before it reorganizes, like a forest that becomes still before a storm breaks. The old pattern is losing energy, but the new pattern has not yet become stable. In this in-between, the nervous system may freeze, not because you are weak, but because the old strategy, fawning, explaining, absorbing, no longer produces safety, and the new strategy, boundaries, stillness, self-possession, has not yet been proven safe by experience. So you hover, and hovering feels like shame, because shame always appears when you are becoming real. Someone will ask, "Is everything okay?" You seem off, and you will feel the old compulsion. Reassure, perform, smile, say you're fine. Or you will feel the urge to explain your inner transformation in detail, to make your boundary palatable. But notice the deeper truth. You do not owe anyone a narrative for why you are finally listening to your own nervous system. This is the beginning of integration. But integration does not look like peace at first. It looks like restraint. It looks like silence. It looks like you not reaching for the familiar roles, and those roles will try to seduce you back. Your own mind will tempt you with old explanations. Maybe you're being dramatic. Maybe you're too sensitive. Maybe you're overreacting. Maybe you're selfish. Maybe you're imagining it. These thoughts are not truth. They are the voice of the system inside you, attempting to restore the contract, but something else is rising underneath that voice. A heavier, quieter authority. It does not shout, it does not justify, it simply begins to sort. This is mine. This is not mine. This is my feeling. This is your projection. This is my responsibility. This is not my responsibility. This is love. This is self-betrayal. And the moment you start sorting, the old relational world begins to wobble, because it depended on your confusion. It depended on your porousness. It depended on your reflex to take on what was never yours. So you will see more clearly, sometimes painfully, how people have used your empathy as a place to deposit what they refuse to face. You will see it in small, ordinary moments. A friend calls and begins speaking in a way that assumes you will listen for an hour. Soothe them, agree with them, validate them, and never mention your own life. And when you pause, when you say calmly that you cannot hold this right now, you will feel their subtle irritation, their disappointment, perhaps their withdrawal. That withdrawal will be framed as you hurting them, but psychologically it is something else. It is the collapse of a projection-based bond. Or you will notice it with a parent. They speak with emotional implication, hinting at guilt, hinting at sacrifice, hinting that you owe them. In the past, guilt would rise in your body instantly, and your nervous system would rush to repair, offer help, offer time, offer apology, offer explanation. Now, guilt rises, but something else rises with it. A recognition that guilt is the currency of this relationship, and you begin to feel the difference between genuine care and coerced caretaking. This difference is everything, because genuine love does not require your nervous system to shut down. Genuine love does not require you to become smaller. Genuine love does not need you to abandon yourself to remain connected. When connection requires self-erasure, it is not intimacy, it is psychic control. And the shame of being too much was the mechanism that kept you controllable. You may not have realized how deeply this shame shaped your identity. It shaped not only your behavior, but your perception. It made you interpret your natural emotional responses as defects. It made you treat your nervous system as an enemy. It made you see your intensity as a burden rather than an intelligence. It made you feel guilty for having a boundary, guilty for having a need, guilty for having a limit. But limits are not pathology. Limits are structure. Limits are the beginning of a self. The psyche cannot individuate without limit. A person without limit remains fused with the expectations of others, and fusion feels like love when you grew up without stable attunement. It feels like belonging, but it is not belonging. It is entanglement. It is the absence of psychic differentiation. Now differentiation begins, and the first sensation of differentiation is often loneliness. Because when you stop being the emotional sponge, the emotional traffic decreases. People call less, they share less, they demand less. They also accuse more. They may say you are distant, they may say you changed, they may say you are cold, but often what they mean is you are no longer available for unconscious use. And your nervous system will interpret these accusations as danger. It will try to shut you down again, to return you to safety by returning you to service. This is why the transition is unstable. You are not simply changing habits, you are changing the psychological economy of your relationships. The nervous system was trained to believe that your survival depends on being useful. So when you stop being useful in the old way, the body panics. It may produce anxiety, insomnia, digestive issues, fatigue, numbness. It may attempt to push you back into the familiar through discomfort, because the body prefers familiar pain over unfamiliar freedom. But you are beginning to tolerate unfamiliar freedom. This is why there is often a quiet phase before inner authority stabilizes. In this phase, you do not feel euphoric, you feel empty. Your old compulsions are weakening, but your new identity is not fully formed. The psyche has stepped out of the old role, but it has not yet fully inhabited the new center. You might not know what you want, you might not know who you are without being needed, You might not know how to relate without performing care. This can feel like disorientation, but it is actually the psyche reclaiming its energy from external attachment. Energy that was spent monitoring others returns to you. Energy that was spent predicting moods returns to you. Energy that was spent absorbing their feelings returns to you. At first, this returning energy does not feel like power. It feels like rawness, like exposed nerves, because you are finally in contact with yourself. And contact with self can be overwhelming when you have lived for years in partial dissociation. You are used to feeling others, you are not used to feeling you. So when you stop carrying, what rises is not immediate serenity. What rises is your own neglected emotion, your own anger, your own grief, your own unmet needs, your own exhaustion. You may suddenly feel furious about things you previously tolerated. You may suddenly feel sadness about how much you gave. You may suddenly feel how early you learned to abandon yourself. And because you were trained to interpret emotion as too much, you may shame yourself for this rising truth. You may say, "Why am I like this? Why can't I just become? Why can't I just let it go?" But you are not meant to let it go prematurely. The psyche does not integrate by bypassing. It integrates by allowing what was split off to come home. This is what shadow work truly is. Not spiritual theater, but psychological honesty. The shadow is not only darkness, the shadow is everything you were forced to disown in order to remain loved. Often, for the empath, the shadow is not cruelty, it is anger, selfishness, refusal, confidence, limit, indifference. These qualities were forbidden, so they were repressed, and repressed qualities do not disappear. They act from underneath. They create symptoms. They create shutdown. They create the strange emptiness you feel when you cannot access your own desire. So as the shame loosens, the shadow begins to return, not as chaos, but as weight, as density, as the capacity to say no without collapsing. And this is what others feel as destabilizing, your weight, your density, because they are used to you being light, soft, permeable. They are used to you bending, and when you become weighted, the relationship must reorganize or it must break. There is no other outcome. This is why people-pleasing is not merely a habit, it is a pact, it is an unconscious promise. I will be manageable, and you will not abandon me. When you break the pact, the other person feels, on some level, that you are threatening the bond. They may not consciously know why they are angry. They may say you are selfish. They may say you are cold. They may say you've changed. But underneath is a deeper panic. If you are no longer the caretaker, then what holds this relationship together? And if the relationship was held together by your self-erasure, then nothing. You are beginning to see this, and seeing it creates another layer of shame, because you may grieve how long you have participated in it. You may feel foolish, you may feel embarrassed, but shame here would be misplaced. You did not choose this consciously. Your psyche chose survival. Your nervous system chose adaptation. You learned to live inside others' expectations because the cost of not doing so was too high. Now, the cost of continuing has become too high. So the psyche begins its quiet rebellion, not through confrontation, not through drama, but through non-participation. You stop returning the call immediately. You stop explaining yourself. You stop trying to be understood by someone committed to misunderstanding you. You stop absorbing their moods. You stop apologizing for existing. It starts in the smallest places. You are in a conversation, and someone makes a comment that subtly shames you. Maybe they roll their eyes when you express something. Maybe they call you sensitive with that familiar, dismissive smile. In the past, you would shrink. Now, your body does something different. It stays present. Your eyes do not drop. Your voice does not soften automatically. You do not rush to prove your value. There is a pause, and in that pause, the other person feels something they are not used to feeling from you: resistance. Not aggression, resistance, a boundary without performance, and they will test it. They will push gently or harshly to see if the old you returns, because the old you made them comfortable. The old you took responsibility for emotional fallout. The old you would laugh it off. The old you would translate their cruelty into your own deficiency. The old you would do the labor of keeping the bond intact. But something in you is tired of maintaining bonds that require your nervous system to shut down. This tiredness is sacred in the psychological sense. It is the psyche's refusal to remain fragmented. It is the self pulling you toward wholeness, not through inspiration, but through necessity. You cannot keep paying the price without dying internally. So you begin to withdraw from the bargain, and as you do, the nervous system will fluctuate. Some days you will feel strong, other days you will collapse into guilt, and you will want to fix everything again. This fluctuation is not inconsistency. It is deconditioning. The body is learning a new truth, that you can survive disapproval, that you can survive misunderstanding, that you can survive someone's disappointment without losing yourself. This is the real initiation for the empath, not learning to love more, but learning to remain intact while loving, because your old form of love was not love. It was self-abandonment in exchange for attachment. And attachment at the cost of self is never stable. It always creates shutdown. It always creates resentment. It always creates a secret inner emptiness. The title speaks of being too much, but what was too much was never your essence. What was too much was the burden placed on your nervous system to regulate others, to anticipate others, to carry the family's unspoken grief, to become the emotional adult in rooms full of children wearing adult bodies. You were not too much. You were made into the container for what the system could not tolerate. And now, as you stop containing it, the system reacts. It becomes louder, more accusing, more destabilized, because the unconscious always resists becoming conscious. It will fight for its familiar structure. It will use guilt. It will use nostalgia. It will use shame. It will use love as a weapon. And this is where you must begin to recognize, without hatred, without judgment, the simple mechanics. When you stop carrying what is not yours, those who depended on your carrying will experience it as abandonment. They will not say, "I miss using you." They will say, "You changed." They will say, "You don't care." They will say, "You're cold," because that is what withdrawal looks like to someone whose inner world has been outsourced to you. So the question becomes not what you should do, but what is actually happening in you at the moment of withdrawal, because the moment of withdrawal is the moment your nervous system meets the old shame. You will feel it in your chest, perhaps a tightening when you do not respond, a heat when you let silence remain, a nausea when someone is disappointed and you do not fix it. That sensation is the old conditioning trying to restore the bargain. It is the nervous system saying, danger, 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 repair now. But beneath that sensation is another, quieter sensation, a steadiness, a small internal alignment, a recognition that if you repair now, you will betray yourself again. This is where the power shift begins, not in the mind, but in the body. The body begins to prefer integrity over appeasement. That preference is what changes your life, because once the nervous system chooses integrity, the old manipulations stop working. Shame loses its leverage. The threat of disapproval loses its power. But first, you must endure the withdrawal symptoms of relational addiction. You must endure the discomfort of not being needed. You must endure the silence that comes when you stop performing. You must endure the loneliness that appears when your role dissolves. And in that loneliness, something profound begins to happen. You begin to discover what you actually feel when you are not feeling everyone else. At first, you may not know, you may feel blank, you may feel numb, you may feel like you have no personality. That emptiness is not your true state. It is the space left behind when the performance stops. The psyche needs time to refill that space with something real. So the nervous system shuts down, not as failure, but as a protective pause while the deeper psyche reorganizes. The shutdown is the psyche saying, I will not keep pouring energy into self-erasure. I will not keep maintaining relationships built on my disappearance. I will not keep living as a function. And you might notice in this pause that you begin to remember things, not memories necessarily, but sensations. You notice what you like, what you don't. You notice how certain people drain you. You notice how certain conversations make you shrink. You notice how some forms of love always leave you tired. You begin to feel disgust at the ways you were used, not as vengeance, but as clarity. Clarity is not loud, it is heavy, and heaviness is what you are becoming. Not heavy as in burdensome, heavy as in grounded, weighted, real, no longer floating in other people's moods, no longer disappearing for approval, no longer frantic to be understood. This is where the false self begins to die. The false self was constructed to survive the family wound. It was constructed to secure attachment. It was constructed to protect you from rejection by making you adaptable. But adaptation became identity. And now the psyche is pulling the identity back from adaptation. You may feel this when you try to people please and it does not work anymore. You try to soften yourself and it feels disgusting. You try to over-explain and you feel depleted. You try to be easy and your nervous system rebels. This rebellion is not immature. It is the psyche refusing to be prostituted emotionally. And when you stop prostituting yourself, when you stop exchanging your inner life for acceptance, relationships begin to reveal their true foundation. Some will deepen, because real intimacy can survive boundaries. Others will collapse, because they were never intimacy. They were dependency. You may begin to see your entire relational history through this lens. why you chose certain friends, why you stayed in certain dynamics, why you tolerated disrespect, why you kept returning to the same kind of person. It was not because you lacked intelligence. It was because the unconscious bargain was still operating. If I can be good enough, if I can be understanding enough, if I can be small enough, I will finally be loved without punishment. But love without punishment requires a different kind of nervous system than the one you were given. Your nervous system was wired for love with threat, love with conditions, love with withdrawal, love with shame. So now, as you withdraw, the nervous system expects punishment. And sometimes it will arrive, people will lash out, they will accuse you, they will withdraw affection, they will attempt to provoke you into the old role. And this is where your body must learn something. You can survive it. You can survive their displeasure. You can survive their misunderstanding. You can survive their projection. The projection will intensify precisely because you are no longer managing it. If you do not absorb their shame, they will try harder to place it on you. If you do not carry their anger, they will try harder to make you responsible for it. This is why the transition can feel like things are getting worse. But psychologically, what is getting worse is not reality. What is getting worse is the system's desperation, and your nervous system, still sensitive, will want to collapse. It will want to shut down, but the shutdown now is different. Before, shutdown was submission. Now shutdown can become refusal. A refusal to engage, a refusal to perform, a refusal to be recruited into other people's unconscious. This is the subtle internal sensation you are beginning to recognize. When you stop carrying family emotion, when you stop being the relational container, your body becomes still. It does not rush, it does not chase, it does not explain. And in that stillness, you begin to sense something you have rarely allowed yourself to sense. The difference between being loved and being used. That difference is not philosophical, it is nervous system level. When love is real, your body softens. When love is conditional, your body tightens. When love is intimacy, you feel more yourself. When love is a contract, you feel less yourself. And once you begin to notice this, the old bargain becomes harder to maintain because the body begins to see. Seeing is dangerous to the system. Seeing is liberation. Seeing is the beginning of the end of shame. But shame will attempt one last argument. You are too much. You are asking for too much. You are making this too serious. You are too sensitive. You are overreacting. If you believed these thoughts before, you will feel them now like a pull backward, a magnetic force dragging you into the old self. And here is the crucial psychological truth. Those thoughts are not your voice. They are internalized voices. They are the echoes of the family wound. They are the mechanisms that kept you manageable. They are the price tags attached to love in your early life. You are not too much. You are becoming less available for exploitation. And exploitation always calls the boundary too much. Too. So you will feel the shutdown. It will come like a wave. You will feel tired. You will feel numb. You will feel like disappearing. But underneath the numbness, a new structure is forming, a new inner spine, not a motivational spine, not a heroic spine, a sober spine, the spine of a person who no longer confuses love with self-erasure. And as this spine forms, you will begin to do something that was once impossible for you. You will let other people feel what they feel without rescuing them from it. You will let them have their disappointment without fixing it. You will let them misunderstand you without chasing them into clarity. You will let them project without returning the energy with defense. This is not coldness, it is psychological cleanliness. And psychological cleanliness is what the empath has been missing, because the empath has been trained to live in other people's emotional waste, trained to breathe it, interpret it, recycle it, purify it, but you are not a purification system. You are a psyche. You are an individual, and the self does not evolve through endless contamination. So the nervous system begins to shut down, not to destroy you, but to protect you from the old compulsion. It blocks the impulse to appease. It blocks the impulse to overfunction. It blocks the impulse to become smaller. And as it blocks, you will feel strange. You will feel as if you have lost your identity, because your identity was built on responsiveness, on being needed, on being safe through usefulness. Now you are learning to be safe through being. And being has no performance. So you may sit in a room with someone and say almost nothing, and for the first time you do not feel guilty. You do not feel compelled to entertain, soothe, bridge, repair. You simply sit, you breathe, you allow the awkwardness to be there, and in that moment, something deep changes. You are no longer organizing your nervous system around their nervous system. That is the beginning, and it will not be comfortable at first, because the body has to unlearn an entire lifetime of associative conditioning. It has to unlearn that silence equals danger, that displeasure equals abandonment, that tension equals catastrophe. It has to unlearn that your role is to prevent storms, but storms are not prevented by self-erasure, they are only delayed. So now, as you begin to stop delaying them, as you stop absorbing them, the storms may arrive in family, in relationships, in dynamics where you were the stabilizer, and you will feel the old pull to return, to calm everything, to make everyone okay again. But this time, when the pull arises, you will notice something else rising with it, a quiet refusal. A refusal to become the container, a refusal to be called too much for simply existing as a full human being, a refusal to equate love with collapse. And this refusal does not feel like anger at first. It feels like stillness, like gravity, like you are becoming harder to move, harder to manipulate, harder to shame. Because shame only works on the self that is still trying to earn belonging through erasure. And that self is beginning to fade. You will notice it as a subtle disinterest in proving yourself, a subtle exhaustion with explaining, a subtle impatience with dynamics that require you to betray yourself. You may not even call it impatience. It may feel like numbness, like shutdown, but it is not emptiness. It is your psyche pulling energy away from false exchanges. The more energy you reclaim, the more your relationships will reveal their true nature. The more you refuse to carry projections, the more you will see who is committed to their own unconscious, and the more you see that, the less possible it becomes to pretend. So you stand in the doorway of something irreversible, not a dramatic transformation, an internal shift. The nervous system is learning to stay online without submitting. It is learning to feel without dissolving. It is learning to remain present without becoming responsible for everyone else's emotional weather. And in that learning, the shame will rise again and again. Because shame is the guardian of the old contract. It will say, you are hurting people, you are abandoning them, you are becoming selfish, you are becoming cold. But what you are becoming is bounded, and when you become bounded, you become difficult to use, which means you become difficult to control. And this is precisely why the people around you, especially those most invested in your emotional availability, begin to react with confusion, irritation, even panic. They can feel the structural change. They may not name it, but they can feel that your nervous system is no longer automatically cooperating with their needs. They will try to pull you back with guilt, with accusation, with emotional intensity, with withdrawal. They will try to trigger the old reflex, repair, soothe, explain, prove, and sometimes you will almost do it. Your fingers will hover over the phone. Your mind will form the message. The old self will say, just fix it. Just make it okay. Just be the bigger person. And then you will feel the new sensation again, quiet, heavy, sober, saying, if you do that now, you will be betraying something that has just begun to stand upright inside you. And you will notice that what is standing upright is not your ego, not pride, not a desire to punish anyone, but a simple inner truth that has been waiting underneath your shutdown for a long time, that love cannot require your nervous system to collapse, and that anyone who needs your collapse to feel close to you is not asking for closeness. They are asking for access, and your body, finally, is starting to understand the difference in a way your mind has tried to understand for years. Because now, when the old guilt rises, the guilt does not feel like morality. It feels like conditioning, and when you recognize it as conditioning, you begin to see the moment where it was installed, and you can almost locate it in time, not as a clear memory, but as a recurring atmosphere, the way your body learned to tense before you spoke, the way you learned to measure your words against an invisible threshold of tolerance, the way you learned to make yourself emotionally cheaper so no one would invoice you with withdrawal. Conditioning is always installed in repetition, not one event, but many small events, each too ordinary to be called trauma, yet together forming a law inside the nervous system. Do not exceed what they can bear. And because you were a child, you translated their limitation into your defect. You did not think, they cannot hold me. You thought, I am too much. That thought is not merely cognitive. It is embodied. It is why your chest tightens when someone looks unimpressed. It is why your throat constricts when you try to say what you need. It is why you feel a wave of heat and collapse when you sense disapproval. The body remembers the consequence. The body remembers that your aliveness cost you attachment, so it learned to trade aliveness for proximity. What you are confronting now is not simply a habit of people-pleasing. You are confronting the early equivalence your psyche formed between love and regulation. In a healthier environment, love is an experience of being held while you are yourself. In your environment, love was often the experience of being held only when you were useful. So your psyche concluded that being yourself is unsafe, and being useful is safety. This becomes the axis around which everything later rotates. The mother complex is lived first in the body as a specific kind of vigilance, not theoretical, not symbolic, but immediate. You learn to sense what she needed before she spoke it. You learn to anticipate her emptiness, her irritability, her longing, her fatigue, and because a child cannot bear the thought that the caregiver is unstable, the child compensates. You become stable for her. You become her emotional counterweight. You become the one who does not make demands. You become the one who understands. That understanding is not maturity. It is a forced adaptation. You learn to locate her state as the center, and you orbit. Later, as an adult, when you feel uneasy in a relationship, you may automatically move into orbit again. Someone seems distant for a day, and you begin to scan. You start reviewing your last message. You consider what you might have done. You consider how to fix it. You consider how to make yourself less disruptive. This is not love. This is the mother complex reappearing as relational gravity. It tells you that the other person's internal weather must be managed, because if it is not managed, you will be abandoned. And the father complex often enters as a different kind of ache, an ache for recognition that never fully arrives. If your father was emotionally unavailable, preoccupied, critical, or merely present in body but absent in regard, you learned that approval is something to earn. You learned that being chosen requires performance. You learned to cultivate competence, restraint, or excellence to secure a gaze that should have been given freely. And then later you find yourself drawn to partners, mentors, authority figures, even friends who hold themselves slightly above you, who require you to prove your worth, who rarely give straightforward warmth. You call it respect, you call it admiration, but often it is the father complex seeking resolution through repetition. If I can finally be seen by the unavailable one, I will finally feel real. This is how repetition compulsion functions in lived experience. It is not that you like pain, it is that the psyche repeats what it knows, hoping for a different ending. It repeats the early scene with new actors. It repeats the emotional contract, I will overfunction, and you will let me stay. I will be small, and you will not punish me. I will be the container, and you will not collapse. It repeats until the psyche learns something more mature than hope. It learns structure. Structure begins where projection is no longer accepted. Projection is not simply accusation. It is a relocation of inner conflict. When someone cannot bear their own feelings, they unconsciously look for someone who can bear them. Your sensitivity makes you a perfect target for this. Because you can bear a great deal, you have borne it your whole life. You know how to hold discomfort. You know how to translate tension into meaning. You know how to find a way to make it make sense. So when another person is flooded, they lean on you. At first it looks like intimacy. They share, they reveal, they confide, but what is actually happening is a transfer. They are transferring raw emotion into your nervous system. And you, because you were trained, begin to metabolize it. You interpret their anger, you excuse their volatility, you soften their cruelty with context. You tell yourself they are wounded, and you may even be right, but the rightness is not the point. The point is that your nervous system becomes the processing unit for their unprocessed material. That is why you feel exhausted after certain interactions. You are not merely listening, you are carrying. Now you are beginning to refuse carrying. And this refusal exposes the hidden architecture of your relationships. There is a particular ordinary moment where this becomes visible. Someone sends you a message that contains emotional pressure but no clarity, a vague accusation, a sigh in text form, a fine, a cold period, or they tell you, I guess I'll just handle it myself, without asking directly for what they want. In the past, you would panic, you would rush to decode it, you would respond with reassurance, question, apologies, you would offer yourself as the solution. Now, you may read it and feel the familiar pull, but you do not immediately respond. You let the ambiguity sit where it belongs, with them, and in that waiting, you feel your nervous system twitch, because you are violating the old law, never let tension remain unresolved. But the truth is that tension was never resolved by your reassurance. It was merely managed by your submission. The system in which you grew up likely used tension as a tool, not consciously perhaps, but functionally. Tension ensured compliance. If you felt guilty, you would perform. If you felt anxious, you would appease. If you felt responsible, you would return. This is why guilt became such an effective lever. Your nervous system learned that guilt is the signal to move toward repair. So when guilt arises, you move before you think. The quiet phase you are entering is the phase where you stop moving automatically. And this can make you appear passive or detached, but psychologically it is active. It is the psyche refusing reflex. It is the emergence of a boundary not expressed through words, but through time. The time you take before you respond becomes a boundary. The pause becomes a boundary. The absence of immediate reassurance becomes a boundary. Because the old you was immediate. The old you was available. The old you was quick to soothe, quick to understand, quick to apologize, quick to make yourself right-sized for the other person's comfort. Quickness was your survival strategy. It prevented escalation. It prevented abandonment, it prevented shame, but it also prevented you from developing an internal center. An internal center cannot form when you are always reacting, so the psyche begins to slow you down. This slowness can be misinterpreted by others as punishment, but punishment has intent. This slowness is not intent. It is physiology. It is your nervous system no longer tolerating the speed of self-erasure. It is your body refusing to sprint toward the other person's emotions every time they flare. You may feel something else in this slowness, a strange emptiness, a loss of urgency. Urgency was the fuel that kept your old role running. Without urgency, you do not know what to do with yourself. You may feel restless. You may feel as if you are failing, but what is failing is the old mechanism, and it must fail for something truer to form. The shame of being too much has two functions. First, it shrinks you. Second, it makes you doubt your perception. When you doubt your perception, you become easy to manipulate. If someone says you are overreacting, you accept it. If someone says you misunderstood, you believe them. If someone implies you are unstable, You question yourself. This is not merely interpersonal conflict, it is an assault on your psychic authority. And because you learned early that your reality was not fully acknowledged, you are vulnerable to this assault. You learned to defer to the emotional narrative of the caregiver. If she was upset, you believed you caused it. If he was distant, you believed you were inadequate. You learned to locate truth outside yourself. Now truth begins to return inside you. This is what others sense and resist. It is not that you become louder, it is that you become less persuadable. Your inner experience starts to have more weight than their interpretation of you. You begin to believe your own nervous system, and to someone invested in your compliance, this feels like rebellion. But it is not rebellion, it is development. The crucial distinction you must begin to recognize is between empathy and absorption. Empathy is the capacity to understand another's state. Absorption is the compulsion to take responsibility for it. You have confused these two because the family wound fused them. In your family, understanding was demanded, not chosen. You had to understand in order to survive, and because you had to understand, you also had to manage. Understanding became management. Empathy became labor. This is why you cannot simply turn it off. It is embedded in your physiology. So the process now is not turning it off. It is separating understanding from responsibility. You can understand someone's sadness without taking it in. You can understand their anger without translating it into your guilt. You can understand their disappointment without treating it as a verdict on your worth. This is the mechanism by which power shifts. Responsibility returns to its proper place. When responsibility returns, you may notice that some people become more dramatic. They may escalate. They may become louder. They may threaten withdrawal. They may attempt to induce panic. This is a predictable consequence, because the old dynamic depended on your panic. If they can trigger your panic, they can restore your movement. They can restore the old contract, and your nervous system will indeed panic at first. That is normal, but you will begin to notice something new in the panic. You will notice that you can let it pass without acting on it. This is a profound shift, because previously panic meant action. Panic meant appeasement. Panic meant texting, calling, explaining, apologizing, offering. Now panic may arise, but you remain still, not rigid, not punishing, still. You allow the panic to move through the body without translating it into self-erasure. That is the birth of internal authority. Authority is not a mental posture. It is the capacity to tolerate discomfort without betraying yourself. It is important to understand the psychological reward you once received for self-betrayal, because without seeing that reward, you will interpret your withdrawal as mere loss. The reward was not only belonging, it was also identity. When you are the one who carries, you feel necessary. When you are necessary, you feel safe. When you are not necessary, you feel exposed. So the psyche clings to the caretaker role not because it enjoys suffering, but because it fears exposure. Exposure to what? Exposure to your own unmet needs. Exposure to the possibility that you were not loved for yourself. Exposure to the emptiness that may appear when you stop performing. Exposure to the truth that you cannot fix certain people and that you were never meant to. So the psyche, in its wisdom, often creates a quiet phase where you do not yet rush to fill the emptiness with new attachments. It withdraws libido, psychic energy from the old patterns. This can feel like depression, fatigue, lack of interest, but it is often a necessary retreat. The psyche is pulling energy back from external compliance so it can build an internal center. You will notice in this phase that you may lose interest in explaining your story. You may lose interest in defending your intentions. You may lose interest in being seen as good. Being seen as good was part of the old bargain. If they see you as good, they will not punish you. If they see you as good, they will not abandon you. So you kept trying to be seen correctly. Now you begin to tolerate being seen incorrectly. This tolerance is the end of a certain kind of shame, because shame depends on the gaze of the other. Shame is activated when you imagine yourself through their eyes and feel you are defective. If you stop living through their eyes, shame loses its grip. It still arises because conditioning remains, but it no longer dictates your behavior. You may see this in a micro scene that is almost mundane. You are on a phone call with someone who is venting, spiraling, demanding reassurance, subtly blaming you for not being more available. In the past, you would stay on the phone until they were calm. Even if you felt drained, you would feel guilty if you ended the call. Now you say, in a calm voice, that you have to go. You do not over-explain. You do not apologize excessively. You end the call, and then you sit in the silence afterward and feel guilt rise like a wave. Your nervous system says, you have done something wrong. You have abandoned them. You are selfish. You are too much. And you do not respond to the guilt by calling back. You simply sit. That sitting is not indifference. It is differentiation. Differentiation means you allow the other person to have their experience without making it your burden. It means you allow them to be disappointed without treating it as an emergency. It means you allow their dysregulation to be theirs. If you can do this repeatedly, the repetition compulsion breaks, because repetition compulsion is maintained by your participation. It requires you to play the old role. It requires you to become the caretaker, the appeaser, the container. When you stop playing the role, the old scene cannot fully restage itself. It may attempt to, but it cannot complete. This is why others intensify it first. They are trying to complete the old scene. They are trying to recruit you back into your part. And if you refuse, the scene collapses into something new. Often what emerges is the truth of the relationship. Some people, when they cannot use you, leave. Others adapt, but adaptation requires the other person to take responsibility for themselves. And many will not. This is not a moral judgment. It is psychological fact. People who have relied on projection and outsourcing will feel attacked by boundaries, because boundaries force them back into their own psyche. So you must understand what is happening when you feel guilt or shame after a boundary. You are not necessarily harming someone. You are violating an old internal contract. That contract was signed in childhood under coercion. It was not free choice, and now your nervous system is learning to revoke it. Revoking it produces withdrawal symptoms, guilt, anxiety, loneliness, the urge to return, the urge to explain, the urge to repair. These urges are not proof that you are wrong. They are proof that the old conditioning is active. And you will notice, if you observe honestly, that the people who truly love you do not require your collapse. They may be disappointed, but they remain. They do not punish you for having a limit. They do not interpret your boundary as a personal attack. They may ask for clarity, but they do not demand self-erasure. This is how you begin to distinguish love from self-betrayal in real time, not as an idea, but as a bodily reality. The family wound is often built on a confusion between closeness and enmeshment. Enmeshment feels like closeness because there are no boundaries. But it is not closeness, it is fusion. In fusion, you cannot feel where you end and the other begins. You feel responsible for their state. You feel guilty when they are unhappy. You feel compelled to fix them. This is not intimacy. It is the absence of separation. Separation was made dangerous in your early life, so you learned to fear it. That fear lives now in the body as shutdown. Shutdown is often your nervous system's way of creating separation when you have not yet learned to do it consciously. If you cannot say no, your body collapses. If you cannot set a boundary, your body numbs. If you cannot leave, your psyche disappears. Shutdown is a boundary of last resort. Now you are learning to create boundaries without collapsing. This is why you may feel exhausted during this transition. You are building a new capacity. You are teaching your nervous system that you can remain present and separate at the same time, that you can stay connected without being fused, that you can love without absorbing. This is not easy. It is development. And because it is development, it will revisit the complexes again, but from deeper angles. The mother complex is not only about caretaking, it is also about guilt as a leash. If your mother used guilt consciously or unconsciously, you learned that her disappointment is lethal. You learned that her sadness is your fault. You learned that her loneliness must be filled by you. So you became the emotional partner in a place you were never meant to be. Later, you will feel drawn to people who evoke that same guilt, who imply that you owe them, who subtly punish you when you take space. The father complex is not only about seeking approval, it is also about the internal critic that continues his voice. You may carry a voice that tells you you are excessive, weak, over-emotional, unreasonable. This voice is not the self, it is the internalized father, or the internalized authority of the system. When you attempt to individuate, this voice becomes louder. It attempts to discipline you back into conformity. It calls your boundaries immature. It calls your needs selfish. It calls your anger too much. It tries to restore the old hierarchy, where your inner life is subordinate to external expectation, and projection attaches to these complexes. If you carry a strong inner critic, you will be vulnerable to external criticism. You will take it in quickly. You will assume it is true. If you carry guilt, you will be vulnerable to guilt induction. If you carry a hunger for approval, you will be vulnerable to withholding. This is why narcissistic dynamics find a foothold. They exploit the existing leverage points in the psyche. So the work of withdrawing is not about fighting others. It is about removing the leverage points, not by force, but by recognition. You begin to see this guilt is not truth, this shame is not truth, this need to explain is not truth, it is conditioning. And each time you see it, you weaken it. But the psyche does not simply release conditioning because you understand it intellectually. It releases it because you behave differently under the pressure is thrown. You do not absorb when the room fills with tension. Each time you do this, something changes structurally. The unconscious bargain loses reinforcement. Reinforcement is what built the bargain in the first place. You learn that self-erasure leads to temporary safety, so you repeated it. Now you are learning that integrity leads to a different kind of safety, internal safety, and internal safety is the only safety that can sustain you. You may begin to notice that your body prefers solitude now, not because you hate people, but because solitude is where the nervous system can recalibrate without being recruited. In solitude, you can feel what you feel. In solitude, you can hear your own thoughts. In solitude, you can notice your own desires. This can feel strange if you have lived for years in emotional entanglement. Solitude can feel like emptiness, but it is also the first environment where the self can be heard without interference. And in this environment, you may begin to recognize something that has been true for a long time. Your compassion has often been used against you, not only by others, but by your own psyche. You used compassion as a way to tolerate unacceptable treatment. You used understanding as a way to excuse disrespect. You used empathy as a way to remain in dynamics that required your disappearance. Now compassion begins to change form. It becomes less diffuse, less self-sacrificial, more precise. It becomes the capacity to see another person's wound without stepping into it. It becomes the capacity to acknowledge their pain without making it yours. This is mature compassion. It does not collapse, but in the transition, you will feel the old pull again and again, especially when the other person expresses suffering. Because your early bargain linked love to rescue, when someone is suffering, you feel compelled to rescue because rescue was how you earned closeness. And if you do not rescue, you fear you will be unloved. So the nervous system shuts down sometimes at the edge of rescue. It freezes, it numbs, it hesitates, and you may interpret this as coldness or failure. But psychologically, it is your system preventing the automatic reenactment. It is the psyche holding you back from repeating the old scene. This is why the title is accurate. Shame makes the nervous system shut down. Shame says, do not be real, do not be intense, do not be needy, do not be angry, do not be separate, and the body, trained to obey, shuts down to comply. But now something new is happening. The same shutdown can become the interruption of compliance. It can become the pause that allows you to choose. Choice is the beginning of freedom, and freedom is not euphoria. Freedom is often quiet, tenser, uncertain, because the old safety was predictable. You knew how to survive by appeasing. The new safety is internal, and it requires tolerance of disapproval. So you will continue to see these micro scenes where your old self would have rushed in. Someone posts something ambiguous online, and you feel the urge to interpret it as a message to you. Someone is quiet, and you feel the urge to fill the silence. Someone is upset, and you feel the urge to fix it. These urges will arise, and your nervous system will feel the familiar shame. If you do not fix it, you are bad. But now you begin to perceive the shame as a sensation, not as a verdict. You begin to notice it as a pressure in the body, and because you notice it, You can remain present without obeying it. You can feel the pressure without turning it into behavior. This is the mechanics of power shift. It is not mystical. It is not a sudden aura change. It is a change in stimulus response. The old pattern was stimulus, someone is upset, response, you absorb and repair. The new pattern is stimulus, someone is upset, response, you recognize. You separate. You remain intact. Each time you do this, your inner authority grows heavier. It becomes less negotiable, not because you become rigid, but because you become aligned. Alignment feels like gravity. It is not loud. It is not persuasive. It simply is. And gravity reorganizes systems. People begin to orient differently around you. Some move closer with respect. Others move away with resentment. This is not personal. It is structural. They are responding to the fact that your psyche is no longer porous. Porousness was how they entered. Porousness was how they controlled. Porousness was how they deposited their shadow. When you become less porous, they cannot use the same entrances. So they attempt to create new entrances. They may appeal to your guilt. They may appeal to your compassion. They may appeal to your identity as the good one. They may flatter you, then punish you. They may alternate warmth and cold. This intermittent reinforcement is especially powerful on the empathic nervous system because it resembles the early environment, unpredictable love, and the nervous system trained on unpredictable love becomes addicted to it. Now you are beginning to withdraw from that addiction. Withdrawal is not linear. Sometimes you will relapse into explaining. Sometimes you will relapse into rescue. Sometimes you will collapse into shutdown and then later realize you were avoiding a boundary you did not know how to set. This is not failure. It is the nervous system learning through repetition. And the concepts must return again, complex, projection, shadow, repetition, because they are not separate. They are one architecture. The complex is the emotional pattern installed by early experience. Projection is the mechanism by which the complex is externalized in relationships. Shadow is the disowned material that fuels the complex. Repetition, compulsion is the behavior that keeps the complex alive. When you withdraw, you interrupt repetition. When you interrupt repetition, the shadow rises. When the shadow rises, projection intensifies. When projection intensifies, the complex is triggered, and your nervous system responds with shame and shutdown. This is the cycle you are in. If you can see it, you can tolerate it. Tolerance is the capacity to remain present while the old pattern tries to recruit you. And presence is the beginning of integration. Integration does not mean you become emotionless. It means you become owner of your emotion. It means you no longer treat your empathy as a public service. It means you stop confusing being good with being available. And as you move further into this, you will notice that the quiet phase becomes more pronounced. Life may feel slower, social life may shrink, certain relationships may thin out. The nervous system may feel both relief and grief. Relief because you are not constantly carrying grief, because you realize how much connection was built on your carrying. This grief is important because grief is the honest recognition of loss. You are losing a role. You are losing an identity. You are losing a familiar way of being loved. And the psyche must mourn this, even if the old love was painful, because it was still love in the only form you knew. But you will not be allowed to remain only in grief. The psyche will push forward because the self does not accept permanent self-erasure. The self is not sentimental, it is oriented toward wholeness. So you will keep encountering moments where you must choose, return to the old contract, or remain in the new stillness. And the stillness will often feel like emptiness. But emptiness is not nothing. Emptiness is space. Space is where your real self can appear. And you may begin to sense, in the middle of ordinary days, that your thoughts are changing. You are less preoccupied with what others think. You are less interested in being understood. You are more interested in being accurate. Accurate to what you feel. Accurate to what is happening. Accurate to the mechanics. This accuracy is the beginning of sobriety, and sobriety is what replaces shame, because shame is a kind of intoxication. It makes you see yourself through distorted eyes. It makes you feel defective for having boundaries. It makes you feel guilty for being human. Sobriety returns you to proportion. It shows you were not too much. You were simply in a system that demanded you be less, and now you are becoming less cooperative with that demand, which means the system will escalate, not always outwardly. Sometimes the escalation is subtle. Someone will become more passive-aggressive, someone will become more needy, someone will speak as though you are responsible for their emotional state, someone will bring up the past, reminding you of who you used to be. Someone will imply you owe them. Someone will test your limits with small requests that are not really requests, they are probes. And each probe is an attempt to see if the old contract still holds. You will feel this in your nervous system as a familiar tightening, a moment where you are about to say yes automatically, a moment where you are about to apologize automatically, a moment where you are about to offer more than you have. And now, because you have begun to sense the mechanics, you may stop yourself mid-sentence. You may feel the shame rise. How dare you hesitate? How dare you not be agreeable? And you may still hesitate. Hesitation is the beginning of freedom, because hesitation means you are consulting your inner reality. Consulting your inner reality was forbidden. So the body will punish you with shame sensations. But if you stay with the sensations and do not obey them, the punishment loses efficacy. The nervous system learns the world did not end when I did not collapse. I survived. And survival is what the child needed to know. Your adult psyche is teaching your child psyche a new lesson. You can survive being too much in the eyes of those who cannot hold you. And this lesson will not come as comfort, it will come as repeated evidence. So you keep going, you keep withdrawing, you keep noticing the subtle internal sensation that arrives when you stop carrying. That sensation is not emptiness. It is separation. It is the self reclaiming territory. And as the self reclaims territory, you begin to feel something else, something that has been buried under shutdown for a long time, a quiet anger, not rage, not vengeance, a clean anger. The anger of realizing how long you have been coerced into self-erasure. The anger of realizing how often you were shamed for being alive. The anger of realizing that your sensitivity was framed as defect because it exposed what others did not want to face. This anger is part of integration, Because anger is a boundary emotion. It signals violation. It signals that something has been taken, and you have had much taken. Your time, your attention, your vitality, your right to have needs without punishment. But you were trained to fear your anger. You were trained to interpret it as dangerous. Because if you expressed anger in your family system, what happened? Perhaps you were mocked, perhaps you were punished, perhaps you were ignored, perhaps your anger threatened the fragile equilibrium, so you learned to swallow it, to turn it inward, to become depressed instead of angry, to become numb instead of direct. Now the anger may rise, and the nervous system may shut down again out of fear of what anger could do. You may feel yourself go blank when you need to speak. You may feel yourself become overly calm when you are actually furious. This is the old shutdown mechanism protecting the system. But the anger is not here to destroy. It is here to bring you back to yourself. And if you can allow the anger to exist without acting it out or suppressing it, it becomes weight. It becomes backbone. It becomes the internal force that prevents you from returning to the old contract. This is the paradox. The empath often becomes stable not by becoming softer, but by integrating the shadow qualities that were forbidden: refusal, indifference to manipulation, the capacity to disappoint, the capacity to say no and not explain. These are not cruel qualities, they are necessary qualities. And you are approaching the point where these qualities will begin to appear more naturally, not as performance, but as integration. You will simply find yourself not answering, not because you are playing a game, but because you are not available. You will find yourself not explaining, not because you are punishing, but because you no longer feel compelled. You will find yourself letting others feel what they feel, not because you are detached, but because you recognize it is theirs. And the system will interpret this as too much, whirls wind, because to a system built on your compliance, your boundary is too much, and you will feel the old shame surge again, perhaps with an urge to collapse and return, and in that surge you will see, in real time, the exact moment where the nervous system tries to shut down to protect you from rejection. And you will notice that the shutdown is no longer only submission, it is also a door closing, a refusal to be recruited, and you will feel yourself standing right at that door, deciding whether to open it again or let it remain closed. And you will realize that what you are truly deciding is whether to keep living inside an unconscious bargain that calls your full humanity dangerous, or whether to endure the temporary loneliness of separation long enough for a new kind of inner authority to stabilize. Because stabilization does not come from being understood by them, it comes from no longer needing to be. And as you recognize that, another memory begins to surface, not as a story, but as an old bodily moment of being shamed for having an emotion, an old scene where you learned to apologize for your own existence, and you can feel now how that scene still lives inside your reflexes, still lives inside the way you tighten when you speak, still lives inside the way you try to be small, and the psyche is moving toward it, not to dramatize it, but to finally name the mechanism that was installed there, because naming it is how you remove its secrecy. The child did not have language for what happened. The child only had sensation, the heat of embarrassment, the shock of being looked at with contempt, the sudden coldness in the room, the withdrawal of attention. The child learned to associate feeling with consequence, and the child, because it could not leave, made a decision inside the nervous system: never let that happen again. This is how shame becomes structural. It becomes a regulator. It becomes a hidden hand that pulls you back every time you approach truth. You may remember it as a moment that others would dismiss. You are crying and someone tells you to stop, not gently, but with irritation. You are excited and someone mocks your enthusiasm. You are angry and someone calls you dramatic. You are afraid and someone tells you are weak. You are asking a question and someone tells you are being difficult. None of these moments are catastrophic in isolation, but together they train the psyche to experience expression as threat, and the body, always loyal to survival, chooses contraction. Contraction is what you now call your personality. The empathic person often lives as a controlled intensity. You feel deeply, but you keep it contained. You sense everything, but you present little. You become the one who holds, who understands, who does not burden. This looks like maturity, but psychologically it is the internalization of a family rule: do not cost us. The most damaging wound is rarely overt cruelty. It is the subtle refusal to make room for the child's inner life. When the child feels that their inner life is inconvenient, the child begins to evacuate it, slowly. So slowly it feels normal, and later, as an adult, you say things like, "I don't know what I want. I'm not sure what I feel. I'm fine. It doesn't matter." These are not true statements. They are adaptations. They are the echo of an inner evacuation. Now the psyche is attempting to repopulate itself, and repopulation is messy, it is slow, it produces symptoms, because when you begin to feel what was not allowed, you do not feel it in neat doses. It comes in waves. It may arrive as sudden grief, sudden anger, sudden fatigue, sudden disgust. You may not understand why you are emotional. You may not have a reason, but the psyche does not require a present-day reason to release what was stored. It releases when it senses conditions have changed. Conditions are changing because you are no longer automatically collapsing to maintain connection. This is what matters. The old arrangement relied on your collapse. Your collapse prevented conflict. Your collapse prevented others from having to confront themselves. Your collapse maintained roles. It kept the family system balanced on your nervous system. Now you are withdrawing your nervous system from that function. So the system begins to wobble, and in the wobble, people reveal how much they relied on you not being fully human. They may not say it in those words. They will say, "You're being selfish," or "You used to care," or "What happened to you?" or "You're so cold lately." The accusation is always the same structure. You are deviating from the role we assigned you, and we feel threatened. You have spent your life responding to threat by returning to compliance, by smoothing, by explaining, by dissolving the tension with your own sacrifice. Now you are attempting something different. You are allowing threat to exist without immediately correcting it. That is a profound reversal, and it is precisely here that projection becomes most intense. Because projection is not merely what others do to you, it is also what you do to yourself. You have projected moral value onto compliance. You have projected virtue onto self-erasure. You have projected goodness onto being easy to be around. This is why boundaries feel immoral, because your psyche has been taught that your value lies in your manageability. So when you withdraw, your own inner critic attacks you. It says, you are becoming difficult, you are becoming unkind, you are becoming too much. It tries to shame you back into the familiar. This inner critic is not your conscience. It is the internalized system. The system's voice lives inside you as a critic because it ensured your survival. If it could shame you early, you could prevent external punishment. The child learned to punish itself first. This is how shame becomes self-sustaining. Later, no one has to shame you. You do it automatically. Now you are beginning to see this mechanism, and seeing it creates a new possibility. You can refuse to obey the critic. Refusal does not have to be loud. In fact, it cannot be loud at first, because loudness would still be reaction. Refusal begins as a quiet non-participation. The critic speaks and you do not argue. You do not try to prove it wrong. You do not spiral. You simply recognize this is not truth. This is conditioning. And you return to your boundary. This changes something inside you, because when you refuse the critic, you are refusing the father complex in its internal form. You are refusing the internal authority that told you you must become acceptable by becoming smaller. And when you refuse it repeatedly, you begin to feel an unfamiliar sensation, self-respect, not a dramatic self-esteem, not grandiosity, but a calm sense that you are not obligated to betray yourself to remain connected. This sensation destabilizes older relational dynamics more than anything else, because those dynamics depended on your lack of self-respect. They depended on your willingness to doubt yourself. They depended on your willingness to over-explain. They depended on your willingness to be shamed. So you begin to notice something. The more you withdraw, the more certain people become childish. They tantrum, they sulk, they punish, they become passive-aggressive, or they become suddenly charming, suddenly warm, suddenly attentive. They may oscillate between affection and contempt. This is not random. It is an attempt to regain influence. They are seeking leverage. They are seeking the old entrances. The old entrances were guilt and hope. Guilt. You're hurting me. Hope. If you just do this one thing, we can be close again. Your nervous system has been trained to respond to both. Guilt makes you move toward repair. Hope makes you move toward effort. This is why repetition compulsion holds. It keeps you in a cycle of effort, followed by disappointment, followed by guilt, followed by more effort. And each cycle reinforces the belief, I must try harder to deserve love. Now you are beginning to stop trying, not because you stopped caring, but because you are beginning to recognize that love is not something you should have to purchase with your nervous system. When you stop trying, the system interprets it as abandonment, but psychologically it is differentiation. You are stepping out of the symbiotic contract. You are no longer agreeing to be the emotional organ for someone else's psyche. This is why life becomes quiet, because when you stop feeding projections, the drama loses fuel. When you stop participating, the relational theater weakens, and in that quiet, you are left with yourself. The quiet phase is where many people become frightened. They fear that they are becoming empty. They fear that they are becoming depressed. They fear that they are losing who they are. But what you are losing is not yourself. You are losing the self that was constructed to serve. The service self always had an audience. It always had something to respond to. It was defined by interaction, by others' moods, by roles, by emergencies. When those emergencies reduce, you feel a void. The void is not pathology. The void is the space where the authentic self has not yet been allowed to grow. Authenticity grows in quiet. It grows slowly. It grows without performance. It grows without urgency. So the nervous system, still trained to equate quiet with danger, may attempt to fill the quiet with old patterns. You may feel tempted to reach out, to fix, to reconnect, to return to familiar dynamics just to relieve the discomfort of stillness. This is the addiction of the caretaker role. It prefers crisis to emptiness, because crisis gives identity, but emptiness gives possibility. The psyche needs a period of non-identity in order to reorganize. It needs a period where you are not certain who you are, because certainty was previously based on adaptation. Now adaptation is being dismantled, so you must pass through an interval of not knowing. Not knowing is where inner authority begins, because inner authority does not come from external validation. It comes from internal contact, and internal contact requires quiet. In this quiet, your complexes will not disappear. They will surface more clearly. You may suddenly notice your body reacting to a tone in someone's voice. You may notice your stomach tightening when someone is displeased. You may notice a desire to explain rising when you sense misunderstanding. These reactions will not vanish quickly. They were built over years, but now, instead of being possessed by them, you witness them. You observe your own conditioning. This observation itself is transformative, because in childhood you could not observe, you were inside it. Now you can see, I am reacting as though I will be abandoned. I am reacting as though displeasure means danger. I am reacting as though my needs are punishable. And because you see it, you can remain still. Stillness is not passivity. It is the refusal to be hijacked. You have been hijacked for a long time by family emotion. The family system's unprocessed material lived through you. You were the site where it was managed. In some families, the empathic child becomes the emotional dumping ground. In others, the empathic child becomes the mediator, the translator, the therapist. Regardless of the exact role, the common structure is the same. The child becomes responsible for what the adults refuse to hold. Now, when you stop holding it, the adults may not change, but the system changes anyway, because your participation was the stabilizing factor. Without your participation, things become more honest. The emotional distortions become visible. The resentments rise. The unspoken becomes spoken. The guilt tactics become obvious. This is why your withdrawal feels like power. Not because you dominate anyone, but because you are no longer available for distortion. Distortion is what shame creates. Shame distorts your relationship to yourself. It makes you see your sensitivity as weakness rather than perception. It makes you interpret your boundaries as cruelty. It makes you treat your needs as burdens. It distorts reality so that you remain manageable. When distortion weakens, reality becomes clearer, and clarity can feel cold at first because clarity removes the emotional fog that once made certain relationships feel meaningful. This is why, during the quiet phase, you may feel less emotionally attached, you may feel less compelled, you may even feel indifferent at times. This does not mean you are becoming heartless. It means your nervous system is no longer addicted to the highs and lows of unstable attachment. Stable attachment feels boring to a nervous system trained on instability. So the psyche must detox from intensity. Many empaths confuse intensity with love because intensity was the emotional signature of home. Home was not calm, it was charged. There was tension, unpredictability, subtle threat, guilt, shifting moods. So when you later encounter those signatures in relationships, your nervous system says, "This feels like home, this feels familiar, this must be love," but it is not love, it is conditioning. Now, as you withdraw, you also withdraw from the addiction to intensity. This is why you may feel empty. You are no longer stimulated by relational volatility. You are no longer in constant scanning mode, and without scanning mode, you may not know what to do with your attention, so attention returns inward. At first, this inward attention reveals pain. You may realize how exhausted you are. You may realize how rarely you have rested without guilt. You may realize how often you have lived with a subtle sense of dread. You may realize how often you have felt responsible for everyone else's well-being. This realization can produce grief again, but it also produces something else, a sober anger at the injustice of it. And as anger rises, the shadow becomes more present. Shadow integration for the empath is not about becoming darker, it is about reclaiming the capacities that protect the psyche, the capacity to disappoint, the capacity to refuse, the capacity to withdraw, the capacity to be misunderstood. These capacities were relegated to the shadow because they threatened early attachment. Now they must be integrated or you will remain vulnerable. Because vulnerability is not only sensitivity, vulnerability is lack of boundary. Lack of boundary is what makes you a target for projection. Projection requires permeability. When you are permeable, others can place their unwanted feelings into you and you will carry them. When you are not permeable, their projection bounces back, not aggressively. It simply cannot enter. This is why power shifts structurally. Your psyche becomes less penetrable by others' unconscious. This is not spiritual, it is psychological. A simple micro scene demonstrates it. Someone says to you, "You're selfish." In the past, you would panic, you would argue, you would explain, you would prove you're not selfish by offering more. Now, you hear it and you notice two things. First, the word lands and your nervous system has a flicker of shame. Second, you see the person's emotional state, their frustration, their entitlement, their fear of losing access. You do not absorb it, you simply recognize this accusation is a strategy. It is not truth, and you do not rush to correct it. You might say nothing. You might say calmly, "I understand you feel that way." You might simply end the conversation, but inside, something important happens. You do not take on the identity they assign you. Not taking on the identity is freedom, because the old you would have taken it on instantly. You would have believed them, you would have internalized it, you would have collapsed. This collapse was the mechanism by which others gained control. You accepted their narrative because you already doubted yourself. Now you are becoming less doubtful. Less doubtful does not mean arrogant. It means you begin to treat your own inner experience as real. This is a radical shift for someone who grew up with emotional invalidation. You begin to trust your body. You begin to trust your perception. You begin to trust your exhaustion. You begin to trust your limits. Limits become sacred. Not sacred as ritual, sacred as non-negotiable. When limits become non-negotiable, your life reorganizes, because every pattern that relied on your negotiability begins to fail. Manipulators cannot work with a person who no longer negotiates their boundaries under emotional pressure. Family guilt tactics cannot work with someone who can tolerate guilt without obeying it. Narcissistic dynamics cannot function when you no longer provide emotional supply through reaction and explanation. So you will see your old patterns attempting to revive themselves. They will attempt to draw you into debate. They will attempt to provoke. They will attempt to make you prove your goodness again. But your nervous system is learning a new rule. Proving is unnecessary. Proving is how the trap works. Proving is always a sign that someone has already decided not to understand you. If someone is committed to misunderstanding you, your explanation becomes a performance. It becomes a submission to their frame. It becomes the continuation of the old contract. I will be acceptable if I can just explain properly. This is how you were trained. You tried to explain your emotions so they would be tolerated. You tried to make yourself reasonable. You tried to shrink your needs into something others could digest. Now you are learning that you do not need to be digested. This may sound harsh, but it is not. It is the beginning of an adult psyche. Children need to be digested by caregivers. Adults do not. Adults require mutual respect and boundaries. So in the quiet phase, you begin to withdraw the childlike hope that if you explain enough, you will finally be met. You begin to see that some people cannot meet you because meeting you would require them to face themselves, and that is unbearable for them. So instead, they keep you in a role. They keep you as the caretaker, the listener, the emotional sponge, because as long as you are busy carrying them, they do not have to carry themselves. When you stop, they feel exposed. Exposure produces panic. Panic produces accusation. Accusation is the attempt to restore the old equilibrium. You will see this and feel tempted to collapse because you have a deep reflex to soothe panic. But notice, their panic is not an emergency for you. It is the natural consequence of their own unprocessed psyche meeting reality. This is where your empathy must become mature. Mature empathy does not rescue the other person from themselves. Mature empathy allows them to experience their discomfort without interference. It is the difference between caring and enabling. You have enabled many people unintentionally because your nervous system treated their distress as your responsibility. Now you are beginning to stop enabling, and because enabling was mistaken for love, the other person may accuse you of being unloving. This is a predictable confusion. The family wound often taught you that love means sacrifice, so you sacrificed, you gave, your energy, your time, your attention, your boundaries. You called it love, but love that requires self-erasure is not love. It is fear of abandonment disguised as virtue. Now you are learning to love without fear. But fear will not disappear quickly. Fear will arise in your body as shame, as guilt, as shutdown. Each time it arises, you have a choice. Obey it and return to the old self, or tolerate it and remain separate. This is why the transition feels like a constant internal confrontation, but not with others, with your own conditioning. The nervous system shutting down is the psyche's way of preventing overwhelming emotion, but shutdown also prevented your individuation because it prevented your truth from being expressed. Now you must learn a different relationship with shutdown. You must learn to recognize when shutdown is protecting you from necessary boundary expression and when it is simply the body needing rest. Often, when you are on the verge of saying something true, shutdown will appear. Your mind will go blank. Your throat will tighten. You will feel numb. You will feel unable to speak. This is the old protective response. If you speak, you will be punished. So the body stops you. But now, because conditions are changing, you may begin to work with this, not forcing speech, not dramatizing, but staying present. You notice the shutdown, you breathe, you allow yourself to feel the fear beneath it. And sometimes, in that presence, the shutdown softens, and you speak quietly, simply, without explaining too much. This is how inner authority becomes embodied. You begin to speak despite the old fear. Not aggressively, not with a speech, with simple clarity. And clarity is terrifying to systems built on ambiguity and guilt, because ambiguity gives room for manipulation. Clarity removes room. When you say, "I won't do that," without explaining, the system cannot negotiate. When you say, "That doesn't work for me," without apology, the system cannot guilt you. When you say, "I'm not available," without justifying, the system cannot recruit you. Recruitment requires your guilt. This is why guilt is such a central mechanism. It is the psychological rope that pulls you back into the role. So in this phase, guilt will be your main withdrawal symptom. You will feel guilty for resting, guilty for saying no, guilty for not responding, guilty for not smiling, guilty for not smoothing tension, guilty for not being who they expect. But the guilt is not evidence of wrongdoing, it is evidence of role departure. You are leaving a role that was never truly yours. And role departure always produces guilt in those trained for enmeshment. The more you depart, the more you will be tested, not always consciously. Sometimes the test is subtle, a comment meant to shame you. Sometimes it is direct, "You've changed." Sometimes it is emotional. Someone becomes sad in a way that invites you to rescue. Sometimes it is nostalgia. Someone reminds you of how close you used to be. Each is a hook. Hooks are designed to reattach you to the old contract. If you do not take the hook, you will feel anxious. The body expects punishment. But what happens if punishment does not come? You begin to unlearn. Unlearning is slow. It requires many repetitions where you do not appease and yet you survive, where you disappoint and yet you remain intact, where you are misunderstood and yet you do not chase clarity. Each repetition builds a new association. Separation is not death. This new association is the foundation of individuation. Individuation does not mean you become isolated. It means you become separate. Separate does not mean distant. Separate means you retain your own psyche in relationship. You do not dissolve. You do not abandon yourself. You do not become a role. The integration phase is approaching. But before integration stabilizes, the quiet phase often deepens, because the psyche must pull back from external entanglement to gather energy for reconstruction. You may feel less social. You may feel less interested in performing closeness. You may find that small talk irritates you. You may feel a desire for simpler, cleaner interactions, not because you are superior, because your nervous system cannot tolerate false exchange anymore. False exchange is the exchange of your emotional labor for their approval. True exchange is mutual presence. Many of your relationships may not contain true exchange, so quiet arrives. And in quiet, you may begin to see yourself differently. You may notice that you have been afraid of your own power. Not power as domination, power as self-definition, power as the capacity to say no, power as the capacity to let others be unhappy with you. You feared this power because in childhood, self-definition threatened attachment, so you learned to make yourself undefined, fluid, adaptable. Adaptability kept you safe then, but now adaptability is costing you your soul, so the psyche begins to stiffen not rigidly, but structurally. It begins to form edges. Edges create identity. Identity creates authority. Authority creates different relationships. And as this happens, you will revisit your childhood bargain again, but with adult eyes. You will realize that you were not loved for being small. You were simply less punished. There is a difference. Less punishment is not love, but the child cannot see that. The child equates less punishment with love because it is the best available. Now you, as an adult, begin to sense that what you called love was often the relief of tension, the relief of being good, the relief of not being in trouble. But love is not relief. Love is recognition. Recognition means you are seen as you are. You may feel grief when you realize how rarely you were recognized, how often you were tolerated only when you performed, how often you were shamed when you were real. This grief is necessary because it dissolves the fantasy that you can return to the old family system and finally be met if you just try harder. Trying harder was the repetition compulsion. Now you begin to stop trying. Stopping is what breaks the compulsion, and breaking compulsion is what begins integration. But integration requires revisiting shadow again, because as you stop trying, you may feel less nice. You may feel less available. You may feel more blunt. You may feel less patient. This may alarm you. You may fear you are becoming selfish. But what you are feeling is not selfishness. It is the emergence of limits. Limits were previously absent, so their appearance feels foreign. Foreignness can feel like danger. And here shame tries to re-enter. You're becoming a bad person. You're becoming cold. You're too much. I fall the time. But too much is often what those who benefit from your self-erasure call you when you stop erasing. So you begin to reframe too much Too much for whom? Too much for what? Too much for a nervous system that cannot tolerate reality. Too much for a family system built on denial. Too much for a relationship that requires you to disappear. Your aliveness is not too much. Their capacity is too little. This recognition is not arrogance. It is proportion. Proportion is what shame destroys and sobriety restores. And as sobriety grows, you become less interested in being forgiven, less interested in being understood, less interested in being the good one, more interested in being clean. Clean means you do not lie with your body. You do not say yes when you mean no. You do not smile when you feel disgust. You do not call sacrifice love. You do not call guilt intimacy. You do not call shutdown peace. You begin to notice your body more. It tells you truth. It tells you which interactions poison you. It tells you which people you cannot relax around. It tells you which dynamics require your nervous system to contract. And because you are now listening, you begin to act differently. Act differently does not mean dramatic. It means you stop going. You stop replying. You stop engaging. You stop volunteering yourself. You stop offering emotional labor for free. You stop being accessible to those who do not respect you. And again, the system reacts. Reaction is predictable. Because your withdrawal changes the pattern, a pattern cannot survive if one person stops playing their role. So the system will attempt to force you back into role. It will try to activate your guilt. It will try to trigger shame. It will try to make you doubt yourself. It will try to make you explain. It will try to provoke you into emotion so it can call you unstable. If you remain calm, it may escalate. If you remain separate, it may accuse. If you do not comply, it may punish. Punishment may be withdrawal of affection, silent treatment, gossip, criticism, triangulation. These are not random. These are tools of control in systems where direct respect is absent. They are attempts to restore hierarchy. You have lived under such hierarchies for a long time, so your nervous system expects them. It expects punishment when you individuate. This is why individuation feels dangerous, but the danger is not always real anymore. The danger is often remembered. The body is reliving an old environment. This is why micro-scenes matter. You may be an adult now, independent, but your body reacts as if you are still a child in a room where a caregiver's mood determines your survival. The caregiver's mood may now be a partner, a parent, a boss, a friend. The body does not know the difference. It recognizes the emotional signature. So the task now is not to convince your mind. The task is to give your nervous system repeated experiences of surviving without appeasement. This is the real transformation. It is slow, and slow is what your psyche is learning, because the old you was fast, fast to fix, fast to apologize, fast to soothe, fast to return. Speed was the currency of your love. You proved love by being immediately available. Now, slowness becomes the currency of your authority. Slowness says, I will respond when I am ready, not when you pressure me. Slowness says, I will not be recruited by urgency. Slowness says, your emotion does not dictate my nervous system. This slowness is unsettling for those who relied on your quickness. So they intensify, and you, if you remain with yourself, begin to notice something startling. Their intensity is not your problem. This realization is the beginning of a boundary so deep it cannot be negotiated. It is not a verbal boundary, it is an internal line. I am not responsible for your inability to regulate yourself. Once that line appears, you begin to feel your own emotions more clearly. Because you are no longer flooded by theirs, you begin to feel your own sadness, your own anger, your own desire, your own fatigue, and you may feel overwhelmed by the return of your own inner life, because it has been muted for so long. This is where shutdown can still occur. Shutdown may arise as a temporary response to the sudden return of feeling, but now shutdown is not permanent. It is a transitional pause, and in these pauses, you begin to sense the shape of the self, not as a mystical entity, but as a quieter intelligence inside you that does not need external validation to know what is true. This intelligence has been present all along, buried under shame and adaptation. Now it begins to surface. You might feel it as a simple knowing, I will not go back, not because you hate anyone, not because you want revenge, but because returning would require you to betray yourself again. This is where your inner authority becomes irreversible. But before it stabilizes, it must survive another round of tests. The psyche must face the deepest fear, that without the old role, you will be alone. The fear of being alone is the anchor of the old bargain, so the psyche will bring it forward. You may experience actual solitude. People may drift, invitations may decrease. You may feel yourself becoming less liked, and your nervous system will interpret this as proof that your boundaries are wrong. It will say, see, you are too much. Say, you are selfish. See, you should have stayed the same. This is the final seduction of shame. It offers you belonging in exchange for self-erasure. And you will stand at that temptation again. You will feel lonely. You will feel empty. You will feel the urge to reach out, to apologize, to soften, to reconnect. And if you can remain still in that loneliness, if you can let loneliness be present without selling your integrity to escape it, something profound will happen. Loneliness will transform into solitude. Loneliness is the pain of believing you are missing something outside yourself. Solitude is the peace of realizing you are returning to yourself. This transformation is not immediate, but it begins here. It begins in the quiet phase, where you are tempted to break your own boundary to relieve discomfort. It begins when your nervous system begs you to return to the old role, because the old role gave predictable connection, and you sit in the discomfort and choose not to return. That choice builds inner spine. And inner spine is what will carry you through the destabilization that follows. Because destabilization is not over yet. The system will continue to test. It will attempt to provoke you into a reaction that proves you are wrong. It will attempt to make you look like the problem. It will attempt to recruit allies, to triangulate, to create narratives. It will attempt to pressure you into returning to your function. And as it does, you will notice something that is both painful and freeing. You cannot control their narrative. You never could. You only maintained an illusion of control by constantly performing. You believed that if you were good enough, people would see you correctly. But people see you through their complexes. People see you through their projections. People see you through their needs. Your performance never guaranteed truth. it only delayed conflict. Now you begin to accept the simplest reality. Some people will misread you, and your nervous system does not have to collapse to correct it. This acceptance is the death of a certain kind of shame, because shame is the belief that being misread is catastrophic. It is not. Being misread is inevitable. And once you accept inevitability, your energy returns. You stop spending energy on proving. You stop spending energy on explaining. You stop spending energy on managing perceptions. Energy returns inward, and with returned energy, a new identity begins to form, an identity not based on being needed, not based on being easy, not based on being the container, but based on being aligned. Aligned means you begin to feel the difference between your yes and your no. You begin to trust your no. You begin to allow your no to exist without apology. And this is where many of your relationships will either adapt or collapse. Adaptation requires the other person to respect your no. Collapse occurs when respect was never present. So you will begin to see which is which. This is not cynical, it is clear. And as you become clear, you will become less explainable to those who relied on your confusion. Because confusion made you pliable. Confusion made you negotiable. Confusion made you desperate for clarity from others. Now clarity arises from within, and that internal clarity makes external persuasion less effective. So you may hear people say, "I don't recognize you." What they mean is, "I cannot locate you in your old role." This is correct. You are becoming harder to locate in the system. You are becoming a person, not a function. And becoming a person requires integration of the shadow qualities that protect personhood. It requires you to stop being afraid of being too much. It requires you to stop shrinking to soothe others' discomfort. It requires you to stop abandoning yourself to avoid being shamed. But this integration is not yet complete. Not yet. Because even as you withdraw, part of you still longs to be understood. Part of you still wants someone to finally say, "You were never too much." Part of you wants a parent, a partner, a friend to finally recognize what you carried. This longing is human. It is also the last thread of the old bargain. The bargain says, if they finally see me, I can relax, but relaxation cannot depend on their gaze. Relaxation must come from your own authority, so the psyche will bring this longing to the surface and confront it. You may find yourself fantasizing about closure, about apology, about being validated. You may find yourself wanting to send one last message, one last explanation, one last attempt, and then you will feel the new spine again, heavy and sober, saying, if you do that, you will be returning to the old economy. So you hold the longing without acting it out. Holding longing without acting is maturity, and maturity is the threshold of integration. Integration means you do not become cold, you become weighted. Weight is not bitterness, weight is reality. Weight is the capacity to remain true without needing to be agreed with. You are moving toward that, and the movement is quiet, the movement is slow, the movement involves many moments of resisting old reflexes, many moments of tolerating guilt, many moments of allowing others to be unhappy, because the deepest freedom for the empath is not being loved by everyone. It is being able to remain yourself even when someone is displeased. This is what your nervous system is learning, and as it learns, you may notice something else. Your sensitivity becomes sharper, not softer, because you are no longer using sensitivity to scan for danger. You are using it to perceive truth. You begin to sense manipulation faster. You sense projection faster. You sense when someone is asking for emotional labor disguised as love. You sense when someone is using vulnerability as leverage. You sense when your guilt is being recruited. You sense and you stop. Stopping is your new power, not dramatic, not announced, simply enacted. And as you enact it, the shame narrative begins to break down, because the shame narrative depended on the idea that your boundaries are excessive. But as you enforce boundaries, you do not die, you do not become unlovable, you do not become cruel, you simply become separate. Separate is what the child was not allowed to be. So the child inside you will protest. It will say, "This is dangerous. This is abandonment. This is too much. This will make us alone." And you, as an adult psyche, will begin to respond not with soothing words, not with reassurance, but with repeated action. "I will not betray us again." Action teaches the nervous system more than words ever did. So you keep acting, and slowly the shutdown changes form. It becomes less frequent, it becomes less total, it becomes more like a pause rather than a collapse. Your nervous system begins to tolerate intensity without dissociating. It begins to tolerate conflict without fawning. It begins to tolerate disappointment without panic. This is authority. Authority is the nervous system's ability to remain present under pressure. And once you have that, the old manipulations fail, not because you become invulnerable, but because you stop cooperating with the old script. And when you stop cooperating, the script collapses. The collapse may feel like loss, it may feel like emptiness, it may feel like disorientation, but it is the necessary cost of leaving a false self behind. And the false self, as it is, will attempt to revive itself through nostalgia and fear. It will remind you of times you were loved when you were compliant. It will remind you of moments of closeness that occurred when you sacrificed. It will romanticize the old role, but you will begin to see soberly what those moments required from you. They required your collapse, and you will ask yourself, perhaps not verbally but bodily, why must closeness require my collapse? This question is lethal to the old bargain, because once you ask it, you cannot unask it. And that is why what you are entering is irreversible. Not because you will never feel guilt again, you will. Not because you will never feel shame again, you might, but because you have seen the mechanism. And once the mechanism is seen, it cannot fully control you. It can only tempt you. So you stand now in the middle of this quiet transition between the old role and the new identity, between the old contract and the new authority, between the old shame and the emerging sobriety. And you will notice that your relationships are responding differently already, some with respect, some with accusation, some with withdrawal, some with intensified need. And through all of it, your nervous system is learning, slowly, that it can remain intact. And the more intact you become, the less confused you are about what love is. And the more you realize that love was never meant to be a transaction of your selfhood for connection, and that the transactions you called love were actually the repetition of an early bargain. And now, as you withdraw from the bargain, you begin to feel the first real hint of integration, not triumph, not fantasy, but a sober internal alignment that makes you less explainable, less pliable, less recruitable. And as this alignment grows, something else becomes clear, something that has been hidden by shame, that many of the people you have carried did not truly know you. They only knew your function. And this realization will cut through you quietly, not as rage, but as grief, because it means that to become real, you may have to accept being alone for a while, and accepting that will be the final test of your nervous system. Because the old panic will rise again and it will ask you to return. And you will feel the familiar urge to reach for someone, to fix, to perform, to collapse. And you will sit with the urge and notice the exact point where the body tries to shut down to avoid the terror of separation. And you will realize that what you feared as separation was actually the beginning of being, and you will feel yourself standing at the edge of that truth, about to cross into the part of your life where you no longer need anyone to validate your reality, where you no longer trade your nervous system for belonging, where you begin to live as a whole person rather than an emotional instrument. And that crossing begins with a single, quiet decision not to return this time, not to soften this time, not to explain this time, because you can finally see what explaining has always been a ritual of self-erasure meant to keep others comfortable. And you are beginning to sense that comfort was never worth the cost. And the psyche, having sensed this, begins to prepare for the final stabilization, where the self does not negotiate anymore, where your boundaries stop feeling like acts and start feeling like nature. And in that preparation, you will notice one last place where the old shame still hides, one last relationship where you still feel like a child, one last person whose disappointment still makes your chest collapse, one last voice you still try to appease. And the psyche will bring you there, not to punish you, but to reveal the final lever. And once that final lever is revealed, the system changes, because there are no more hidden controls. What remains is not a dramatic confrontation, but a sober recognition of where you still become small. There is usually one relationship, one emotional authority, one figure, sometimes a parent, sometimes a partner, sometimes a sibling, sometimes a person who resembles a parent in the only ways that matter, whose displeasure still reaches directly into your nervous system and turns it into a child again. You can feel it as soon as their tone changes. Your posture alters. Your voice becomes careful, your mind begins to preemptively justify, you begin to perform innocence, you begin to explain before they even accuse. This is the last stronghold of the complex, because complexes do not disappear, they loosen where their emotional leverage is removed. The leverage was always the same, the fear that if you are fully yourself, you will be abandoned or punished. The family wound made that fear plausible. The psyche then organized itself around avoiding that outcome. It became excellent at avoidance, so excellent that you stopped recognizing avoidance as avoidance. You called it love. Now you are no longer willing to live inside that translation. You can still care, you can still feel, you can still be empathic, but you are no longer willing to confuse caring with carrying. And this is where the final stabilization begins. Not as a feeling of victory, but as a change in what your nervous system will and will not do. At this point, you stop negotiating with the inner critic, not by fighting it, but by no longer treating it as an authority. The critic may still speak, especially when you disappoint someone, especially when you withdraw, especially when you refuse, but its voice does not determine your action. Its voice becomes part of the weather, not part of the compass. This is what internal sovereignty looks like. The capacity to hear old conditioning without being governed by it. When you are governed by shame, you live as though you are on trial. You keep presenting evidence of your goodness. You keep providing explanations like alibis. You keep trying to prevent the verdict, but the trial never ends. Because the trial is not about facts, it is about control. A system that relies on your self-erasure cannot ever acquit you, because your acquittal would mean your freedom. So you stop trying to be acquitted. You withdraw your participation. This withdrawal is not hostility, it is clarity. Clarity means you understand the mechanics of projection and you stop responding as though projection is information about you. Projection is information about the other person's inner world. When someone insists you are selfish because you have a limit, they are revealing their expectation of access. When someone insists you are cold because you stop explaining, they are revealing their dependence on your emotional labor. When someone insists you are too much because you have feelings, they are revealing their inability to tolerate reality. This does not make them evil, it makes them limited. And limitation is not your problem to fix. In the earlier stages, you might have heard this and still tried to fix it, because fixing was your identity. But identity is shifting now. It becomes less relationally dependent. It becomes less defined by reaction. Your nervous system begins to accept a simple adult reality. Other people's limitations are real, and you do not need to make yourself smaller to accommodate them. This is where the father complex and mother complex are revisited one final time, not as concepts, but as bodily truth. The mother complex loosens when you stop feeling responsible for another person's mood. The father complex loosens when you stop trying to earn recognition from someone who cannot offer it. Both complexes loosen when you stop locating authority outside your own experience. You will notice that the pull weakens. The same person who could once destabilize you now creates a reaction that is smaller, briefer. You still feel it. You are not numb, but you no longer reorganize your whole inner world around it. The reaction is contained, it passes, and you do not chase after it with behavior. That is the change. The change is not that you never feel guilt. The change is that guilt no longer has the power to mobilize you into betrayal. Betrayal is the correct word here. Not betrayal of them, betrayal of yourself. You have betrayed yourself many times in small ways. So small you called them normal. You agreed when you meant no. You smiled when you felt hurt. You forgave when you were still bleeding. You explained when you were not safe. You stayed when your body was asking to leave. Each betrayal was an installment payment toward belonging. But belonging purchased through betrayal is never stable. It produces shutdown, resentment, emptiness. The psyche cannot thrive in a home built from its own sacrifices. So now you stop paying. This is what creates the grounded, upright feeling at the end of this process. Not happiness, not triumph. A sober uprightness. You begin to stand inside your own nervous system without apologizing for its signals. You no longer treat exhaustion as weakness. You treat it as information. You no longer treat discomfort as something you must immediately neutralize with appeasement. You treat it as the natural friction of differentiation. You no longer treat someone's disappointment as a verdict. You treat it as their experience. This is a structural shift. It changes your relationships because it changes your availability. You become less available for unconscious contracts. You become more available for real contact. And real contact requires reciprocity. It requires respect. It requires that both people hold themselves. Here, the quiet phase ends not with a grand moment, but with a series of small confirmations. You realize, without drama, that you do not need to explain. You realize you can leave a conversation without closing it perfectly. You realize you can say no without being convincing. You realize you can be misunderstood and remain calm. You realize you can let someone be upset and still sleep at night. This is the point where your nervous system begins to trust you. For years, it could not. It was constantly recruited into survival mode because you kept returning to dynamics that required you to betray yourself. The nervous system does not trust words. It trusts behavior. When you repeatedly protect yourself, when you repeatedly refuse the old contract, the nervous system stops bracing. It begins to settle. It begins to feel less threatened by ordinary tension. The shutdown response becomes less necessary because you are no longer forcing the body to stay in situations where it must collapse to survive. And because the shutdown response becomes less necessary, you begin to feel more, but this feeling is not chaos, it is clarity. You begin to feel your own emotions as yours, not as contaminated by others. You begin to feel your own desires, not as compromised by what others expect. You begin to feel your own grief without turning it into self-blame. You begin to feel anger without turning it into shame. You begin to feel joy without anticipating punishment. That last piece matters more than you think. Many people who were trained by shame cannot feel joy cleanly. Joy feels dangerous. Joy feels like it will be mocked. Joy feels like it will be taken away. So joy is muted. The psyche keeps joy small because joy once provoked envy, contempt, or dismissal. But when your inner authority stabilizes, you become less concerned with how joy is perceived. You are no longer asking permission to exist. Joy becomes quieter and more stable, less performative. This is the integration you are moving toward. You do not become cold, you become weighted. Weight means you no longer float in other people's emotional atmosphere. You have an internal center of gravity. You can feel empathy without being pulled into absorption. You can care without over-functioning. You can love without losing your shape. Shape is the word. You develop psychological shape. People who grew up in enmeshment often lack shape. They have high attunement but low boundary. They can feel others easily but cannot locate themselves. They can predict moods but cannot name their own needs. They can soothe, but cannot refuse. Shape is what emerges when you integrate the shadow qualities you were forced to repress. Refusal, limit, autonomy, the capacity to disappoint, the capacity to remain silent. Silence is central here, not as a tactic, not as a weapon, not as an aesthetic. Silence as the natural consequence of not needing to manage perception. In earlier stages, you over-explained because explanation was the child's attempt to prevent punishment. Explanation was the child's attempt to be tolerated. Now, silence becomes possible because you are no longer living as the child. The adult does not need to beg for toleration. The adult recognizes what is not negotiable, and one of the things that becomes non-negotiable is your nervous system. You stop sacrificing it. You stop offering it as collateral for connection. If connection requires you to feel chronically anxious, chronically guilty, chronically small, it is not connection. It is a contract that benefits someone else's unconscious. This is where the difference between love and self-betrayal becomes unmistakable. Love does not require you to disappear. Love does not require you to constantly prove your worth. Love does not require you to translate your pain into something palatable. Love may include conflict. It may include disappointment, but it does not include the systematic erosion of yourself. Self-betrayal always has the same signature. You feel a tightening, a shrinking, a compulsive need to correct, a fear of being too much. You feel you must preemptively manage the other person's reaction. You feel you must perform safety. Love has a different signature. Your body remains present. Your breath is deeper. Your mind is not strategizing. You do not feel that you are on trial. Once you can feel this difference, you stop arguing with yourself about whether something is healthy. You no longer need endless analysis. The body becomes a reliable witness, and because you trust the witness, you stop returning to places where you must betray yourself. This is the sober uprightness that marks the end of confusion. It does not make your life perfect. It makes your life clean. Clean means fewer entanglements. Clean means fewer hidden contracts. Clean means less drama, less urgency, less emotional debt. Clean means when you give freely, not as payment. Clean means when you say yes, you mean yes. Clean means when you say no, you do not need a courtroom argument to support it. Clean means you do not accept guilt as proof. Now, some people will not survive this change in you. They will leave, or they will become distant, or they will become resentful, and you will not chase them. Not because you are indifferent, but because you have recognized that chasing was always a symptom of your old fear. Chasing was an attempt to maintain connection through self-erasure. The adult psyche does not chase people who require your collapse. The adult psyche lets them have their narrative. It lets them go. Letting go is not an act, it is a consequence. When your inner authority stabilizes, you begin to live by a quiet rule. You do not negotiate your reality with people who are invested in distorting it. If someone repeatedly misreads you in ways that serve their needs, you stop trying to correct them. Correction was always an invitation for more distortion. You simply withdraw your availability. Availability is what you control. You cannot control whether they approve of you. You cannot control whether they understand you. You cannot control whether they project. You can control whether you participate. You can control whether you offer your nervous system as a container. Once you see this, you become internally sovereign. Sovereignty is not isolation, it is boundary. In sovereignty, you can still be close, but closeness now has conditions, not moral conditions. Structural ones. Closeness requires respect. Closeness requires reciprocity. Closeness requires that the other person does not demand your self-erasure as entry fee. If those conditions are not met, you may still feel care, but you do not offer closeness. You remain separate. This is not punishment, it is alignment. Alignment means your behavior matches your inner truth. The reason you felt confused for so long is that your behavior did not match your truth. You felt pain and you smiled. You felt violated and you forgave. You felt exhausted and you offered more. You felt unsafe and you explained. This mismatch creates psychological fog. Fog is what keeps you stuck. When you stop mismatching, fog clears, and the clearing feels like sobriety. Sobriety is often quiet. It can feel almost boring because it lacks the old intensity. It lacks the old urgency. It lacks the emotional highs and lows that once defined your relationships. But what replaces intensity is stability. And stability is what allows the psyche to develop without constant shutdown. So you may notice that your nervous system becomes less reactive. You may notice you sleep differently. You may notice your appetite changes. You may notice you have more time, and time will feel strange, because time was previously consumed by emotional labor. Time was consumed by rumination, by replaying conversations, by drafting messages, by managing tension. When that decreases, you have empty time. This empty time is where you will meet yourself, and meeting yourself does not require an audience. One of the most significant changes at this stage is that you stop needing to announce your boundaries. You stop needing to justify your withdrawal. You stop needing to declare your growth. You simply live it. You say less. You do less. You carry less. You explain less. And because you explain less, you become harder to manipulate. Manipulation requires dialogue. It requires your engagement. It requires your emotional investment in being seen as good. When you withdraw that investment, manipulation loses its partner. This is why the final feeling is not confusion, it is clarity. You will know with quiet certainty. When you are in a dynamic of self-betrayal, your body will tell you, and you will not argue with the signal. You will not shame yourself for it. You will not call it too much. You will not call yourself sensitive as an insult. You will simply honor the signal. Honoring the signal is adult love toward yourself. And this is what was missing. You were trained to love others by betraying yourself. Now you begin to love yourself by not betraying yourself, not in a sentimental way. In a structural way. This structural love has consequences. It means you may lose some connections. It means you may disappoint certain people. It means you may be called cold. But these consequences no longer destabilize you, because your nervous system no longer interprets them as death. It interprets them as information. It interprets them as the natural cost of not living as a function. And this is where the shame of being too much finally loses its organizing power. Shame may still arise as a sensation. because sensations linger, but it no longer determines your identity. You do not believe the story. You do not collapse under it. You no longer treat yourself as a burden for having depth. Depth was never the problem. The problem was being in systems that required you to flatten yourself. Now you stop flattening, and because you stop, you become more real. Your emotions become more proportionate. Your empathy becomes cleaner. Your relationships become fewer but more accurate. You develop an internal standard. You do not participate in dynamics that require you to abandon yourself. You do not try to be loved by those who need you to be small. You do not confuse anxiety with intimacy. You do not confuse guilt with devotion. Devotion is not self-erasure. Devotion, in its mature form, is presence with boundaries. So you will find yourself no longer explaining, not as a strategy, but because there is nothing to explain. Your boundaries are not arguments, they are facts. Your inner state is not up for negotiation. Your limits are not a debate. And because you stop explaining, something else happens. You stop trying to make others comfortable with your truth. You let truth be uncomfortable, not to punish, but because truth is not designed for comfort. Truth is designed for reality. And when you begin to live in reality, you become internally upright. Upright means you do not bend to fit the old roles. Upright means you can be kind without collapsing. Upright means you can be firm without cruelty. Upright means you can be silent without guilt. Upright means you can walk away without a speech. This is the end of the confusion that once kept you performing. You can still love your family. You can still care for people, but you will no longer carry what is not yours. You will no longer be the emotional organ of the system. You will no longer translate others' dysfunction into your responsibility. You will no longer accept the label too much as a reason to shut down your life. You understand now what too much really meant. Too much for their avoidance, too much for their denial, too much for their limited capacity to hold another person's reality. That is not a verdict on you. It is a description of them. So your nervous system no longer has to shut down to survive their limitation. It can remain online, present, and separate, and that is integration, not coldness, not triumph, not fantasy. Weighted, bounded, aligned, you no longer confuse love with self-betrayal because you can feel the difference without thinking. You no longer feel the urge to explain yourself to anyone because you recognize that explanation was never about being understood. It was about avoiding punishment. You no longer need to avoid punishment by shrinking because you are not living under the old law anymore. You are living under a different law now, one that the psyche recognizes as necessary for wholeness. You do not abandon yourself to remain connected. And with that law in place, your life becomes quieter, clearer, more structurally honest. You may not have more people around you, but you will have yourself, and having yourself is not a poetic idea. It is the felt experience of a nervous system that no longer collapses to earn love, a psyche that no longer bargains with shame, a person who can stand in a room, feel tension, and not immediately offer their soul as payment to make it go away.